There is a tax you pay every single day. It never shows up on your paycheck. You will never receive a bill for it. No politician will ever campaign on raising it, and no law was ever passed to authorize it. Yet over the past century, this invisible tax has quietly transferred trillions of dollars from ordinary working people to governments, banks, and those positioned closest to the source of new money. The dollar in your pocket today buys roughly 3 cents of what it bought when the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. 3 cents. Where did the other 97 cents go? That is not a rhetorical question. That wealth did not vanish. It moved. And understanding where it moved and who took it reveals one of the most powerful wealth transfer mechanisms ever devised by any civilization in human history. This is the story of the inflation machine, how it works, who it serves, and why you almost certainly know less about it than you should. Most people think of taxes in a simple way. The government takes a percentage of your income, and you see it disappear from your paycheck. If taxes go up, you notice. If a new tax is proposed, it becomes a political fight. Politicians who want to raise taxes face consequences at the ballot box. This is how taxation is supposed to work in a democracy. The people consent to being taxed because they can see it happening. They can vote against it if they choose. But what happens when a government finds a way to tax its citizens without ever passing a law, without ever putting a number on a form, and without most people even realizing money has been taken from them at all? That mechanism exists, and governments have been using it for thousands of years. It is called currency debasement. Today, we call it something softer. We call it monetary policy. We call it quantitative easing. We call it economic stimulus. But behind all the technical language sits a very old trick. When a government spends more than it collects in taxes, and when it cannot borrow enough to cover the gap, it can simply create new money. This new money enters the economy and chases the same goods and services that existed before. More money chasing the same amount of stuff means prices rise. That rising price level is what we call inflation. And inflation, at its core, is a tax on every single person who holds that currency. Think about it this way. If you have $10,000 in a savings account and inflation runs at 7% for a year, you still have $10,000 at the end of the year. The number in your account has not changed, but that $10,000 now buys only $9,300 worth of goods compared to when you started. You did not write a check to the government. No line item appeared on your bank statement labeled tax, but $700 of purchasing power quietly evaporated from your savings. That $700 did not disappear into thin air. It was redistributed to the government that printed the money, to the borrowers who paid back loans in cheaper dollars, to the asset owners whose property values rose with inflation. Your wealth shrank so that others could expand theirs. The beauty of this mechanism, from a government's perspective, is its invisibility. Raise income taxes by 5% and voters will notice and likely object. But inflate the currency by 5% and most people will not make the connection. They will blame greedy corporations, supply chain problems, or foreign countries. The government can spend more without asking permission, and the average citizen never quite understands who picked their pocket. But how does this money creation actually happen? When people imagine money printing, they often picture giant presses churning out stacks of green bills in some underground facility. That image is almost entirely wrong. The vast majority of new money is not printed on paper at all. It is simply typed into existence on a computer. The process centers on the Federal Reserve, America's central bank. When the government wants to spend more money than it has collected in taxes, it issues bonds. These bonds are essentially IOUs, promises to pay back the borrowed amount plus interest at a future date. In normal times, private investors, foreign governments, and banks buy these bonds. The government gets cash to spend, and the bondholders get a safe investment. But what happens when the government wants to borrow more than the market is willing to lend? Or when interest rates would spike too high if it tried to flood the market with bonds? That is when the Federal Reserve steps in. The Fed can buy government bonds from banks and financial institutions. When it does this, it does not pay for those bonds with money it already has. It creates new dollars out of nothing. A keystroke on a computer adds billions to the account of whichever bank sold the bond. That bank now has fresh money it can lend, invest, or use to buy assets. This process is called quantitative easing, and it is described as a tool to stimulate the economy. But in practice, it is money creation on an almost unimaginable scale. Between 2008 and 2014, during and after the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve created approximately $3.5 trillion through this process. Many economists warned this would cause runaway inflation. It did not, at least not immediately. The new money largely stayed within the financial system, inflating asset prices rather than consumer goods. The stock market soared, real estate recovered and then climbed to new highs, but wages barely moved. Consumer price inflation remained muted because the money was not reaching ordinary people. It was circulating among banks, corporations, and investors. Then came 2020. The pandemic triggered an economic shutdown, and governments worldwide responded with stimulus programs of unprecedented size. In the United States, the Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet from roughly $4 trillion to nearly $9 trillion in just 2 years. Trillions more were created and funneled directly to individuals in the form of stimulus checks, enhanced unemployment, and business loans. This time, the money did not stay in the financial system. It hit the real economy at exactly the moment supply chains were breaking down. More dollars chasing fewer goods. The result was the highest inflation America had seen in 4 decades. But here's the part that rarely gets discussed. When new money enters an economy, it does not arrive everywhere at once. It enters at specific points and flows outward like ripples in a pond. The people closest to where new money is created benefit the most. By the time that money reaches workers at the edge of the economy, prices have already risen to reflect the increased money supply. This phenomenon has a name. It is called the Cantillon effect, after Richard Cantillon, an 18th century economist who first described it. Imagine the Federal Reserve creates $1 trillion and uses it to buy bonds from major banks. Those banks now have $1 trillion they did not have before. They might use it to make loans to corporations, invest in real estate, or buy stocks. Each of these actions pushes prices upward in those markets. Corporations might use their cheap loans to buy back shares, driving stock prices higher and enriching executives with stock options. Real estate investors bid up property prices, pricing out first-time homebuyers. By the time that newly created money eventually filters down to wage earners in the form of slightly higher wages, the cost of housing, healthcare, education, and basic goods has already climbed. The workers' raise is swallowed by higher prices before they ever get to spend it. This is why the stock market can hit record highs while working families struggle to pay rent. This is why billionaires saw their wealth nearly double during the pandemic, while average households fell deeper into debt. The money was created. It just did not reach everyone equally. It traveled a path, and that path had first class and economy sections. Those riding first class arrived at their destination wealthy. Those in economy arrived to find that everything they wanted to buy had already gone up in price. Some skeptics might argue this is a uniquely American problem, or a modern problem, or something that only happens during emergencies. History suggests otherwise. The pattern of currency debasement destroying savings and enriching those closest to power is as old as money itself. Consider the Roman Empire. At its height, Rome minted silver coins called denarii. These coins were the foundation of trade across the ancient world. A Roman soldier was paid in denarii. A merchant priced goods in denarii. For centuries, the denarius contained approximately 95% pure silver. But empires are expensive. Wars, public works, corruption, and the demands of maintaining civilization across vast territories require enormous spending. When tax revenues fell short, Roman emperors faced a choice. They could cut spending and face political backlash. They could raise taxes and risk revolt, or they could quietly reduce the silver content in their coins and mint more of them. They chose the third option. Over 2 centuries, the denarius went from 95% silver to less than 5%. The coins still looked the same, but they were worth a fraction of their former value. Prices rose across the empire. Soldiers demanded higher pay. Trade became chaotic as merchants no longer trusted Roman currency. By the 3rd century, the empire was experiencing severe inflation, economic disruption, and political instability. The debasement of currency did not cause Rome's fall on its own, but historians widely agree it accelerated the decline. The empire had essentially taxed its citizens through inflation until the economy could no longer function. Spain offers another warning. When conquistadors brought shiploads of gold and silver back from the New World in the 16th century, Spain seemed destined for eternal dominance. But flooding an economy with precious metals without a corresponding increase in goods and services produces the same result as printing paper money. Prices in Spain rose dramatically. Workers demanded higher wages, making Spanish goods more expensive than those of competitors. The manufacturing sector withered. Spain went from the richest nation in Europe to a declining power within a few generations. Easy money proved to be a curse, not a blessing. The 20th century brought even more dramatic examples. Weimar Germany after World War I faced crushing war reparations and a devastated economy. The government resorted to printing money on a scale previously unimaginable. In January 1921, a US dollar was worth about 65 German marks. By November 1923, $1 was worth over 4 trillion marks. Prices doubled every few days. Workers received wages twice daily and rushed to spend them before they became worthless. A loaf of bread that cost half a mark in 1918 cost 200 billion marks by late 1923. The middle class, whose wealth was held in savings accounts and fixed-income investments, was annihilated. Their entire life savings would not buy a single meal. Those who held tangible assets, real estate, factories, gold, or foreign currency, survived and often thrived. The Weimar hyperinflation did not just destroy money. It destroyed trust in institutions, democracy, and social order. What followed was the rise of extremism that would consume Europe and the world. Zimbabwe in the 2000s and Venezuela in the 2010s demonstrated that these dynamics had not faded into history. Both nations, facing fiscal crises and political turmoil, resorted to massive money printing. Zimbabwe's inflation reached an estimated 89 sextillion% in 2008. Prices were doubling every 24 hours. Venezuela's economy collapsed as inflation exceeded 1 million%. In both cases, the pattern was the same. Government overspending, currency creation to cover deficits, price increases, loss of confidence, economic collapse, and immense suffering for ordinary citizens, while the politically connected found ways to survive. The common thread across millennia and continents is clear. Currency debasement may offer short-term relief for governments, but it ultimately transfers wealth from those who save and earn in that currency to those who spend it first or own assets that rise with inflation. The question is not whether this pattern exists. History has proven it beyond doubt. The question is whether the United States and other major economies currently running enormous deficits financed by money creation are somehow exempt from these forces. The numbers tell a troubling story. When the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, its stated purpose was to stabilize the banking system and maintain the value of the dollar. Over the following century, the dollar lost approximately 97% of its purchasing power. A pair of shoes that cost $10 in 1913 would cost over $300 today. A house that cost $5,000 might now cost $500,000. Some of this reflects genuine economic growth, improved products, and increased quality. But much of it is simply the result of a continuously expanding money supply. Consider what has happened to wages versus productivity. In 1973, the average American worker could support a family of 4 on a single income. Median wages, when adjusted for inflation, have barely budged since then, yet productivity, the amount each worker produces per hour, has nearly doubled. Where did the gains go? Partly to corporate profits, partly to executive compensation. But significantly, into the financial system itself, visible as soaring asset prices. If wages had tracked productivity, the median worker would earn nearly twice what they do today. Instead, they earn about the same in real terms while working to afford houses that cost 3 times as much relative to income, healthcare that consumes an ever larger share of the budget, and education that has increased faster than almost any other sector. This is not an accident. It is the predictable result of monetary expansion that flows first to financial assets, and only gradually, if ever, to wages. Official inflation measures consistently understate what average Americans experience. The Consumer Price Index uses a basket of goods weighted by government statisticians. But that basket often underweights the categories where costs have risen most dramatically, like housing, healthcare, and education. It uses substitution adjustments, assuming that if steak becomes too expensive, you will buy chicken instead, and thus your cost of living has not really risen. By these metrics, inflation appears manageable. But ask anyone trying to buy a home, pay for college, or cover medical bills whether their cost of living has only risen a few percent per year. There is also a strange phenomenon buried in how we think about financial progress. If your salary increases from $50,000 to $60,000 over a decade, you feel wealthier. The number on your paycheck went up. But if inflation ran at 30% during that decade, your purchasing power actually decreased. You can buy less with $60,000 today than you could with $50,000 10 years ago. Nominal gains mask real losses. This illusion keeps people from recognizing how much the inflation tax has taken from them. Each generation adjusts its expectations downward. Young adults today expect to rent longer, retire later, and accumulate less than their parents. They accept this as normal rather than recognizing it as the result of policy choices that systematically eroded the value of their labor. So who benefits from this arrangement? The winners are surprisingly consistent across time and geography. Governments are obvious winners. Inflation allows them to spend without raising taxes. It also reduces the real value of their debts. The United States owes over $34 trillion in national debt. If inflation runs at 5% per year, the real value of that debt shrinks by 5% annually without a single dollar being repaid. Inflation is essentially a hidden tax that simultaneously reduces government debt burdens. For politicians, this is almost irresistible. Spend today, let future inflation erode what you borrowed. Large borrowers of all kinds benefit. Corporations that borrow at fixed rates to buy assets see those assets rise in value while their debt stays the same. Real estate investors who finance purchases with mortgages profit doubly. Their property values rise with inflation while their mortgage payments stay fixed. A family that bought a home for $200,000 with a 30-year mortgage might see that home worth $600,000 in 20 years. Their debt remained at $200,000, but it can now be paid off with devalued dollars worth a fraction of what they borrowed. Wealth managers and sophisticated investors benefit because they understand these dynamics. When inflation rises, they move into assets that tend to appreciate: real estate, commodities, equities, and in some cases, gold or other hard assets. They hedge against currency debasement while average savers watch their bank accounts quietly lose value year after year. Who loses? Savers lose. Anyone who holds cash or fixed income investments denominated in an inflating currency watches their purchasing power evaporate. Retirees on fixed incomes lose. Their Social Security checks might get cost of living adjustments, but those adjustments are based on CPI figures that understate true inflation. Workers whose wages lag behind price increases lose. First-time homebuyers who are priced out of markets lose. Anyone without access to sophisticated financial advice loses. The pattern creates a self-reinforcing cycle of inequality. Those with assets benefit from inflation, becoming wealthier and able to acquire more assets. Those without assets fall further behind, priced out of markets and watching their savings dwindle. The rich get richer not necessarily through superior talent or harder work, but through their positioning relative to the money supply. This helps explain why, despite steady economic growth, wealth concentration in America has returned to levels not seen since the Gilded Age. What happened after 2020 accelerated these dynamics to an extraordinary degree. In response to pandemic shutdowns, the federal government authorized over $5 trillion in direct spending, from stimulus checks to enhanced unemployment to business loans. The Federal Reserve provided the financing by expanding its balance sheet by nearly $5 trillion in just 2 years. This dwarfed anything attempted after 2008. And unlike the earlier round of quantitative easing, this money flowed directly into the real economy, into bank accounts of citizens and businesses, just as supply chains were collapsing and production was disrupted. The results were predictable to anyone who understood monetary mechanics, but somehow shocked policymakers. Inflation surged to levels not seen since the early 1980s. Home prices jumped 40% in 2 years. Used cars became more expensive than new cars had been. Groceries, rent, and services all spiked. The Federal Reserve, having spent years claiming inflation would be transitory, was forced into the most aggressive rate hiking cycle in modern history. But raising interest rates is a blunt instrument. It slows the economy, kills jobs, and risks recession. Meanwhile, the excess money that was created does not disappear. It simply continues circulating, pushing up prices from sector to sector. Perhaps the strangest aspect of the entire system is how invisible it remains to most people. Revolutions have been fought over explicit taxes far smaller than what inflation silently removes from bank accounts each year. The American Revolution was sparked in part by a tax on tea. The French Revolution had roots in tax grievances, yet inflation, a tax potentially larger than any visible levy, generates almost no political backlash. There are no protests against the Federal Reserve's balance sheet expansion, no movements demanding stable currency. The mechanism is too abstract, too obscured by economic jargon, too easily blamed on other factors. This is not accidental. Financial complexity serves those who benefit from it. If average citizens understood that every dollar printed diminishes the value of every dollar they hold, there would be far more scrutiny of monetary policy. But the system is designed to be opaque. Central banks issue statements in deliberately dense language. Policy decisions are made by appointed officials, not elected representatives. The media reports inflation as if it were a natural phenomenon like weather, rather than a direct consequence of policy choices. Each generation grows up with the expectation that prices always rise, that a dollar today will buy less tomorrow, that you must constantly run faster just to stay in place. This is treated as economic law rather than what it actually is, a policy choice that benefits some at the expense of others. Consider the psychology of gradual impoverishment. If your wallet were picked once and you lost half your savings overnight, you would be outraged. You would demand police, investigations, restitution. But if 1% of your savings vanishes quietly each month, adjusted downward through inflation so slowly you barely notice, you accept it as normal. Like a frog in slowly heating water, you adjust to each incremental loss until it is too late to react. A young person entering the workforce today might earn a higher nominal salary than their parents did at the same age. But adjusted for housing costs, healthcare, education, and real purchasing power, they are often worse off. They cannot articulate why they feel squeezed. They do not understand the mechanics of what has been taken from them. They simply sense that something is wrong, that the economic rules they were taught no longer match the reality they experience. Central banks around the world know the history. They know what happened to Rome, to Spain, to Weimar Germany, to Zimbabwe. They insist that modern economies are different, that they have the tools to control inflation, that independent central banks will never allow hyperinflation. And in fairness, the post-war era has not seen hyperinflation in major developed economies. But the absence of hyperinflation does not mean the absence of damage. A currency that loses purchasing power steadily over decades accomplishes the same wealth transfer as a dramatic collapse, just more slowly and less dramatically. There are signs that even the slow, steady version of the inflation tax is reaching limits. National debts have grown to levels that make traditional repayment almost impossible. The United States owes more than its entire annual economic output. Japan owes more than 250% of its GDP. Many European nations are heavily indebted. These debts can realistically only be managed through some combination of inflation, default, or dramatic tax increases. Inflation is the politically easiest path. It requires no votes, no negotiations, no visible policy. It simply requires central banks to keep buying bonds and governments to keep spending. Meanwhile, global trends suggest a growing unease with the dollar-dominated monetary system. Central banks around the world, particularly in China, Russia, and other nations outside the Western Alliance, have been buying gold at the fastest pace in over 50 years. These purchases accelerated dramatically after Western sanctions froze Russia's dollar-denominated reserves in 2022. The message was received around the world. Dollars held in banks can be seized, gold held in vaults cannot. Whether this represents the beginning of a genuine shift away from dollar dominance or merely a temporary hedge remains uncertain, but the trend is unmistakable. Countries that once trusted the dollar as the ultimate safe asset are diversifying into something older and less controllable by any single government. So where does this leave the average person watching these dynamics unfold with limited ability to influence policy? There are no simple answers, and nothing presented here should be taken as financial advice. But understanding the mechanics matters. Recognizing that inflation is not a natural law but a policy choice, one that systematically benefits some groups over others, changes how you perceive the economy. Knowing that assets typically outpace currencies in inflationary environments explains why older generations who bought houses decades ago seem wealthy, while younger generations struggle to afford the same homes. Understanding the Cantillon effect clarifies why stock portfolios of the wealthy explode during money printing, while wage workers feel left behind. The inflation machine operates continuously. It does not stop during recessions. It does not take holidays. It runs quietly in the background of every economic decision, invisibly taxing every paycheck, every savings account, every pension. For those positioned to benefit from it, it generates enormous wealth. For those who do not understand it, or who cannot access the same financial tools as the wealthy, it slowly erodes the value of everything they have worked to build. Throughout history, every currency ever created has eventually been debased, devalued, or destroyed. Some collapsed quickly in spectacular crises. Others faded slowly over centuries. None has maintained its purchasing power indefinitely. The dollar, despite its global dominance, shows no signs of being the exception. The only question is the pace and the degree. Some economists believe modern central banks have the tools to manage this process indefinitely, keeping inflation in a comfortable range that allows the system to continue. Others point to rising debts, geopolitical shifts, and historical patterns, suggesting that control is more fragile than policymakers admit. Believers in hard money, whether gold, Bitcoin, or other alternatives, argue that the entire fiat currency experiment is destined to end in crisis, as every previous experiment with unbacked paper money eventually did. What seems undeniable is that the inflation tax will continue operating as long as the current system exists. Governments will keep spending more than they collect. Central banks will keep accommodating that spending by expanding the money supply. Prices will continue rising. Those who understand these dynamics will position themselves accordingly. Those who do not will keep running on a treadmill that moves faster every year, wondering why they never seem to get ahead. The dollar in your pocket is not just a piece of paper. It is a claim on goods and services, a store of your labor and time. When that claim is diluted by new dollars entering the system, part of your labor has been taken from you without your consent. There is no form to sign, no receipt to review, just the slow, quiet erosion of everything you thought you owned. And by the time most people notice, decades of wealth have already been transferred, the tax already paid, to beneficiaries who understood how the machine worked all along. The question is not whether the inflation machine exists. The question is whether you will continue paying into it blindly, or whether understanding how it works changes anything about what comes next. Every generation before this one eventually learned this lesson. Some learned it through gradual decline. Others learned it through catastrophic collapse. The history is written. The patterns are clear. The only thing that varies is how long people remain unaware of the tax they pay every single day. They hold a currency that someone, somewhere, is quietly creating out of nothing.